So my name is Russell Thomas, and I'm here to present on the topic of performance metrics. The title is tuned to the B-Sides audience. It's both accurate, I think, and compelling. So I've got a couple quick questions for the audience, as I want to understand who you are and what your needs are. So show of hands if you consider yourself a metrics person, either because you're a manager and you deal with metrics, or you are an analyst or somebody who creates metrics for management. Okay, very good. Second question is, I have a spreadsheet, a working piece of software that you can download and start using either for demo purposes or to adapt to your own needs. But I'd like a show of hands of people for whom it's a priority that I spend time in this talk walking through the spreadsheet. The alternative is I spend a little bit more time on slides, or we have more time for Q&A. So show of hands for people that it would be important to have some time walking through the spreadsheet. Okay, so I see two hands. So I'm going to make an executive decision not to do that. If you go to Exploring Possibility Space, blogspot.com, you can download this presentation. You can also download the spreadsheet. And if anybody wants to connect with me after the talk, I've got some time, and I can also connect at a later time to walk you through the spreadsheet. Okay? So, we're all metrics dudes and dudettes in this room. How would a metrics dude improve their primary relationship? Interesting approach. Well, the metrics approach, as compelling as it is for us, may or may not be successful in any circumstance for a whole variety of reasons. One of which is, how do you encompass everything that has to do with your primary relationship into a metric on some scale, and in such a way that the audience, that is your partner, buys into it? So what I've just said, in a nutshell, is a direct analogy to performance metrics in security. My talk today is a practical method how you can address some of these complexities. Just a caveat on what I'm not going to do. This is not a method that eliminates all need for thinking. So you still have to think. Second thing is, the first time you do this, you will not be done. The first time you do this, you will learn what you need to do the next time and the next time and the next time. It is explicitly designed for continuous learning and improvement. The last thing is, it will not work all the time because not all circumstances are suited for creating an aggregate metric. I would argue, based on a certain number of years of experience in relationships, that putting your relationship happiness into a performance index is not a path to success. So what do we mean by an aggregate index? I'm using the word performance in here, but it's really any aggregate index on a scale that aggregates a lot of different pieces of what I'll call ground truth data, or indicators. And I'll take the word truth here loosely. It's stuff that you can find and see and gather. Could be audit results. It could be how long your staff has been in place. It could be greatly detailed statistics on your IDS traffic. It's anything that is very close to the day-to-day reality of security. Okay? So what a performance index does is try to boil and synthesize and put into a blender all of that information into some kind of scale that some decision makers can make use of and make decisions on. Okay? William James, one of my favorite pragmatist philosophers, might construe this way. An aggregate performance is a construct. It's something we make a decision on. It doesn't necessarily exist on its own in reality. And it expresses a judgment about how this thing is all working. And it is important to the extent it is useful and valid. So we're going to touch on some of these themes, but one of my hats is an academic. I'm in a PhD program, so I like invoking philosophy whenever possible. So, in case you hadn't noticed, performance indexes are pervasive in our society. There are some people who might even say it's an infectious disease of Western society, but I'll leave that for the after-talk conversation. College rankings. I have a son entering senior year of high school. College rankings and the consequences of college rankings are all on our mind. Everybody goes through performance reviews. There's school performance indexes, credit scores, standardized tests, happiness indexes for whole countries. One of my favorites, the hotness quiz from Cosmo. There's also a male version of the hotness quiz. This didn't take too long to find. And the interesting thing is, out of all of these quizzes, you answer a bunch of questions, you feed a bunch of data, and somewhere behind the quiz there's some wisdom to tell you whether you're hot or not, or your college is good or not, and so on, based on some numbers. And even in the realm of information security, there are more and more index-based services. So here are two companies that offer this as part of their product offering. There's a number of consulting firms and other organizations that publish index-like information about security. Cybercrime Index from a few years ago. Here's a fairly elaborate report that comes out of Booz Allen Hamilton. I've highlighted the phrase down here, simple average. This is a theme we're going to touch on. And most of what you've seen, most of what I flashed through here, how do they arrive at this number on this scale from all this information? It's typically what I call the usual method, some sort of weighted average. Now, I'm the kind of guy that reads the fine print that explains the method for getting these methods. I can't remember a time when I didn't see some version of the weighted average as being the methodology. Okay, hold on to your seats. Here's some math. What is a weighted average or sum? So S here is the score. Each of the X's is a different piece of information or different metric. The W's multiplied by each one is the weight. The rule is the weights have to sum to 1. And this is how you end up with your score. Now, the thinking behind this, the people at Booz Allen Hamilton, the people at US News World Report, they have meetings. And they go back and forth between, well, this factor is important, no, this factor is more important. They respond to their constituents, because colleges don't like it when their rankings fall. So they lobby for this. And this is all arguments over weights. Show of hands, just out of curiosity, how many people in the room have ever been in one of those meetings where you were arguing over the weights associated with scores? It's a cause for an extended happy hour afterward, if not more serious medication. I'm not going to go into these, but there's a bunch of statistical methods that are also based on this linear model type thing. Many of these modeling approaches have amazing applications and an amazing power, but the simple underlying truth behind them is they're all starting with this linear weighted sort of approach. So I want you all to think about what I call the performance hypothesis or model that's behind this. Every element is independent. Okay, so generally there's no x1 times x2 factor in there, right? Every element, x1, contributes the same weight to all possible scores. And all contributions are linear. I like graphics. So we've got 3 workers. They're pushing up on this structure. We want to know what's the upward force on this. And we might say the weights are the intrinsic strength of each man. The x's are how hard they're pushing. sum them together, and that's a good estimate of the force pushing up on us. But does it work in the world of information security or the other realms that we operate in? One of my favorite hobbies with my son is to play the realistic battle game Total War. So we spend a lot of time looking at what constitutes a successful defense against various attacking technologies. So if you think about that linear performance model and contrast it with the world that we live in, there are some easy and obvious alternative performance models that make sense in certain cases. So I've listed just a few, and this is not comprehensive. One is the weakest link, right? So some set of defenses or some set of detectors fail if any one of them fails, or whatever the lowest performance is. The best effort is the reverse of it. So this is like you got a basketball team, you got a star player, the other players may be schlubs, but maybe that best player is going to carry your effort. House of cards, where you have cascading effects. I'm going to explain the drunk under the lamppost idea. These variables work really well as long as the system stays within the known range, or within certain known parameters. So the drunk can find the keys under the lamppost as long as the keys are under the lamppost, but outside they can't find the keys. So it was frustration with this, having lived through it, and also thinking about some need to express performance in cybersecurity generally that led to this. And I did some research on academic methods and reasoning based on evidence and uncertainty, and came up with this. This slide shows the key ideas to this method. Each of these pieces, each of these metrics, the values, are treated not as numeric things to operate on with arithmetic. They're treated as pieces of evidence. You put them together to estimate the weight of evidence for every value in your performance index. So if you have 5 possible values, you have essentially 5 formulas that weigh, does this evidence point to a value of 1? Does it point to a value of 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on? Looking at the distribution of weight of evidence gives you information about the quality of your evidence and how strong you can make claims. When I first gave this talk, this next line got a cheer of applause. This method works on spreadsheets. You don't have to learn R. In fact, I started doing a demo in R, and it was actually more complicated to do in R than on a spreadsheet. Our corporations are populated with people who are skilled in spreadsheets. Your executives will feel comfortable if it's in a spreadsheet. So there's a lot going on, at least there's a lot going on that I'll walk you through. There's nothing about it that requires higher math. And I'm not going to talk about this aspect, but I do believe that this method can work in a machine learning or big data environment if you want to tune and refine your performance hypothesis based on more detailed analysis. So with brazen lack of humility, I've labeled this a Thoma scoring system. Why? I get no money from this. I got no fancy hairdo. I got no tattoos. I got no piercings. This is my personal branding. So it's available Creative Commons attribution share alike. And I've made the spreadsheet available, which is documented, and you can free to use and edit that. So I like diagrams. If we think of the scope of things that the usual method can solve, the Thoma scoring system can do that and more. On the blog site, I've got a sort of tutorial blog post about this, and I do a replication where I say, here's how you do the weighted sum method if you really wanted to. So I prove that it can replicate it, and it can do a lot more. So now I'm going to go through some of the key concepts of the output you get relative to some of the inputs, and then I'll walk you through sort of a simplified demo. So we're using the mathematics of probability to express degrees of belief around each score value. So put aside in your mind probability associated with experiments, or what percentage of people in this room are over this height. This has nothing to do with experimentation or frequentist statistics. We're using the tools of probability from a mathematical standpoint to express degrees of belief. So if I have complete belief that the value of this performance index is 3, this is what the graph would look like. All of my evidence is on 3, it goes up to 1, and there's no weight of evidence on any other. So that's how you interpret that. And by the way, in the weighted method, if you come up with a score of 3, this is what it communicates. Okay? More complicated. What if I know for sure it is not 3, but I have no reason for choosing among the others? This is what it would look like. There's no way to express that point of view or that belief system with the usual method. This is a uniform distribution. Maximum entropy is the fancy term. This is, I have no belief in any alternative or any other, or equal belief. So there's a dual interpretation here. John Maynard Keynes, some of you know from Keynesian economics. Many people don't know he did pioneering work in using probability as expressing degrees of belief or weight of evidence. Some of you may have heard of Bayesian updating. The method we're using today can be viewed as a manual method of Bayesian updating. But the advantage of it is you don't have to go through the statistical mechanisms of estimating all of these and doing the Bayesian update procedure. But it is essentially compatible with this from a mathematical standpoint. Okay, so here's a toy demonstration of how this might work. So over on the left-hand side, let's say this is my pile of possible evidence. These are different metrics taking on different values. And to start out with, before I have allocated them, I have no belief over any values, so my default is this uniform distribution. Okay? So I allocate one piece of evidence. But this piece of evidence is not very informative to me. It tells me, well, this is not 1, it's about 2 or above, but it doesn't differentiate. So look what's happened up here. So the weight of evidence on number 1 after you do normalization. By the way, normalization, all it does is convert this unbounded scale to a scale that goes between 0 and 1. So I have a little bit more belief that this up here, but I still can't rule out 1 because look at all the evidence I haven't yet allocated. Okay, now I've allocated some more evidence. 3 starting to look more promising, but not very much. So if I'm doing the scoring system, and this is all the evidence I have, I know something more than I did before, but as an analyst, do I report this to management as a 3? Or do I say, we're in the process of understanding this. We only have a hazy idea and we're not yet ready to report a number. All right? So, and I don't know about you, but the executives that I've worked out will sort of respect that better than numbers that keep changing all the time or numbers they don't understand, that sort of thing. And by the way, if they say, well, what do you mean you can't report the number? You say, well, we know 3 things. We don't know 7 things. And we think it's important to know at least 5 more things before we can say anything with confidence. Right? It leads to a very straightforward, transparent conversation. Now, some of my favorite cases. Security, sometimes you're going to find situations where you have metrics telling you diametrically opposite things. In fact, I think it's pretty fruitful to have diametrically opposite information, because my audit team goes in and talks to a bunch of people, and they say, oh yeah, our patches are up to date, and everybody's gone through training. And then you've got a bunch of log stuff that shows that they're clearly not up to date. That is a sign that further investigation, you don't have a full picture of what's going on. So, look at what happens when you have ambiguity. You start seeing multiple peaks, and depending upon the relative strength of them, you may not be able to decide analytically what's the true message here. Now, this is one of the great failure modes of the usual method, because if I have all of the weight on 5 and 1, and none of the weight anywhere in between, those average out to 3, and there's no way to differentiate that from the case where I have no information or all the information, all the evidence on number 3. So, let's be clear about what we're doing here. We are modeling your reasoning and judgment from evidence, so I call the performance hypothesis, and the nature of that evidence. It's not a model of the world. You own the model of the world. You're answerable to it. All this does is make clear, well, what do we mean by this? How do we put this all together? What's the whole picture? There's a little bit more math, a little bit more formality. So your index has n values. You have k metrics. Each metric or combination of metrics is treated as evidence. So the ith score is the multiplication of the condition upon which this metric is applied, its relevance, and its significance. And I'm going to go through and explain what I mean by each one of these. Yes, sir? That is a superb question. Did everybody hear his question? The question is, do you feed back the number of metrics that you have? Because as you increase them, that changes the probability, right? Let's go back here. Another way of expressing that is, what if this pile here grows? Do you even need to know how many things have not yet been allocated? One of the important, less understood features of this method, this is a no free lunch method, is you need to make some allocation for that which you have not yet measured, that which you have not yet assessed. And there are many academic books written on, well, how do you get your arms around that, and how do you estimate it, and how do you bound it. In practice, there's no better way to do it other than sort of the logical process of a framework. So I've published a 10-dimension performance framework. NIST has a cybersecurity framework. To me, the value of frameworks, it helps define the universe in which you are operating. And then subdividing that universe, and you can start saying, how much do we know about this piece? How much do we know about this piece? How much do we know about their interrelations? If you go through that process logically, I think you can come up with an estimate of this. And there's another way to do it, which is, remember I mentioned that learning cycle before? All of us will start out with a very crude and probably a bad model. Right? We start out with what we have, we put it together, we look at the results and say, crap, I can't use that. And then you send your staff off, I need metrics on this, we need to start measuring that. And you start putting those together. Well, some of those things are going to be really informative. Right? When I was working with our firewall team, and I'm trying to understand our response time on implementing firewall requests, staff turnover was not first on my list of things to look at. Eventually we got to the point where it was like the most important thing to look at. So through an iterative process of trying to evaluate the evidence, seeing its implications, going back to the process, you're learning more and more about what you know, what you don't know, the impact of what you know, and hopefully you start throwing away metrics which are redundant and not informative. Okay. So, before I get into sort of a toy example, I want to talk about this one here, because it's, I'm a little dissatisfied with how I've described it, and it may not be obvious to people. If I have any given metric, let's say the simplest one, audit result, pass or fail. How informative is that audit result, and under what conditions? Do I want to put the result of that audit in sort of at a raw level, so it's informative about the scores? Or maybe that audit result combined with something else is informative. Maybe the failure of the audit and some other condition might be more informative than either one of them alone. So what I have here in the method is two types of conditions. These are logical conditions that return true-false results. One I call the metric condition, conditions on metrics. You use these to produce evidence. So if I have a metric on defects, software defects, let's say, that may be an unbounded scale, but for my purposes, my performance hypothesis, what I care about is it 0? Is it less than 5? Is it less than 100? Or anything else, right? So it helps you fine-grain or chunk these things in ways that are useful for you. And the second is when you group or combine conditional relationships between metrics, as in the case that I just described, right? So you don't have to do anything like this if you don't want to. I found it very useful in terms of highlighting the value ranges in the metrics that are informative to my performance hypothesis. The second, I'm calling logical condition or dependence. These are conditional relationships that govern when I apply this to the performance score. So even though I may come up with these as individual pieces of evidence, I may not apply them all at the same time. So in the spreadsheet demo, which I'm not going to spend time on, this was a maturity model, a questionnaire-oriented maturity model. And we chose to have a scoring system that was based on two logical conditions that would automatically reduce the performance score if they were true, right? If you had so many deficits, it would start knocking it down. And if you had one of 5 red flags, no matter what the other scores were, it would take you all the way down. Okay? So that's how you can factor these in a way that doesn't blow up your scoring system. You don't have to hide it somewhere in some obscure spreadsheet cell, and you can balance that out with the other aspects. Okay, so this is a completely goofy scorecard. This is just some random collection of metrics I cobbled together. So these are the values of the metrics. Here are 2 metric conditions based on metric number 1. Did I pass? Did I not pass? The logical conditions I just talked about. Now, relevance multiplied by significance. Oops, sorry. These two together gives the weight to these conditions. So weight is not probability. Weight is dependent upon the total amount of evidence. You go through the normalization process at the end to convert it to probability. So if you want to get your hands on this, I've got the demo spreadsheet available for download. It's fully functional. You can work with it. What I'm going to give you is a little bit of a cartoon version of it using these goofy ones. So if I've got no data, it produces a chart with this uniform distribution. Here are all of the metrics values at the highest level. Notice that it has not produced 0 weight of evidence on these other scores. And that is totally related to the logic of my performance hypothesis. So even with these scores here, I cannot rule out the possibility that in reality it's a 4 or a 3. So as you tune your performance hypothesis compared to your evidence, you're always asking yourself, do I really believe this? How much does this really tell me? Is this related to that? And you do so in a way that is transparent, meaning all the information is on the spreadsheet in a logical place, again, not buried in formulas. Quick aside, how many were in Michael Reutman's presentation earlier on the CVSS? He told us a story about CVSS scoring method. CVSS scoring basically is a weighted performance score. Somebody in the mailing list said, yeah, I'm noticing that we're getting a real cluster of scores around 9.2. That doesn't really look very good, so I put in this little factor here to spread out those numbers here. That's exactly what I mean by fudge factor. And if that's all that happened, it may not be so bad. You take something like CVSS, and it going through revision after revision and different use, and it's hard to know what it means anymore after some time. So here is the reverse case. All of the scores are at their most negative value. And by the way, it totally depends upon the logic of your scoring system to determine whether or not this is going to happen. One of my early versions of my security maturity was not giving scores in the lower range. I checked my logic, and I checked everything, and it turns out I didn't really have conditions set up that would highlight the lowest level of performance. So it starts taking you as an analyst back to the question of what evidence do I have across the range, not just typically what's going on. So here's a score where all the values are right in the middle. So this is sort of the sanity check. This is the scoring system as I would intuitively expect based on the inputs. So however you use the spreadsheet, you always want to go through the sanity check to make sure you don't have a typo or an error. So what happens when this is a muddy mix case? Well, you have no clear central tendency. Now I have two diagnostic metrics that evaluate this distribution. One of them is called clarity. And that simply means how much of this mass is behind any one of them, right? Is it a clear peak or is it spread out? And here we show the clarity number is not very good. Okay? Here's our old bugaboo of ambiguous evidence. So I actually have a separate diagnostic around ambiguity. And this simply measures, are there multiple modes and what's the weight of those modes and how far apart are they. So here's the worst case ambiguity I can get, right? So I've got some of these at their worst level and some at their best level. So this gives me my worst case. So I think I've harped on a lot of these benefits. In the interest of time, I think I'm going to skip on to some of the next details. It's not well publicized that there's more than one variety of uncertainty. If you've ever gone to a statistics class, if you've ever read books on statistics, even noted economists and behavioral scientists, they'll talk about uncertainty as though it's one thing. There's some interesting work. One of my favorite authors is Smithson. He talks about a whole tree. I like to think of it as sort of a tropical rainforest of gnarly, nasty varieties of uncertainty, and some of them are listed here. The usual method can deal with some of these somewhat well. So if some of my metrics are vague, the typical approach is, well, we'll do an upper limit and we'll do a lower limit and we'll publish that. It's like, okay, that might work. What if I have varying precision, right? So some of these things I'm measuring to high precision, some to a single digit. I probably still have to use the min-max approach. What if some of the metrics have some systematic errors or some errors I can't control for, missing data? But when these things don't line up arithmetically, enter the fudge factors, my friend. So this is my boldest claim in the whole thing. And if you guys try this out and you find it does not handle some of these things, I'm really interested. Now, I mentioned before, this is not a magic bullet. There are circumstances where the evidence you have and the way they interact will not result in a sensible performance index. There are, paradoxical, completely systematically dysfunctional cases, or things by which the evidence you can't get to by the means that I just described. But I think this will handle a hell of a lot more cases in a reasonable way, right? Not burying and hiding it, but bringing out the nature of this uncertainty and what you might do about it. So here's a quick overview of a couple of cases where this has been applied. So our context was we're doing vendor maturity. The decision really is not whether we're going to use the vendor, but under what circumstances do we make the case they need more reviews, or maybe an executive approval, that type of a thing. Our focus was on questions, and we needed the questionnaire to be simple and not the BITS assessment or some of these others that are really elaborate. So our performance hypothesis, we had a lot of people who had a lot of years of vendor assessment. And it really came down to, well, if we see these 5 things, we know they're crap. We don't need to investigate everything else, and that's the red flag model. Then we started identifying things that were clearly deficits, but in themselves would not qualify as a red flag. But if we saw too many of them, that would sort of get into that category. And we also said, we're not going to make the highest rating to be an easy thing, because that's not really important to our analysis. Vendors get no benefit. We really want, given this limited survey of information, we really want to have it to be pristine. The next case here, very different setting. We're talking about operational support for firewalls. The goal is to maintain security operation functionality as we shift organization responsibility. We had lots of interesting sources of ground truth, and yours truly as an analyst spent a lot of time pouring through a lot of data, looking for correlations and relationships and so forth, and trying to figure out how we're going to put this together in a way that management can make decisions. It turns out that the simplest performance index was going to be the best because the nature of the action was so binary. The decision is, do we need to take corrective action or not? If we need to take corrective action, that means the manager's going to spend time with them. We may need to shift some resources. The performance index was not going to do all that work. Okay? So these 3 levels in the performance hypothesis had to do with the performance on these individual items that I'm listing here. So there were some automated ways to collect them, and the scoring was relatively simple because we could see if availability or change request or adequacy of monitoring, existence of disaster recovery was or was not in place. A relatively easy thing to see if those were happening or not. It turns out that one of the most critical things driving this from an operation quality standpoint had to do with staff turnover and whether the new staff and the old staff were in place at the same time to make sure that no requests fell through the cracks and people were properly trained. So the last case I'm going to talk about was sort of the genesis of all of this. I don't know how many people in this room are on the hook to evaluate your information security for your whole organization. If you are, you have my support and sympathy because it's a really challenging job. It's vital, because executives make decisions. They spend money, they make business model decisions, they put stuff in the cloud, they put stuff overseas, they decide to outsource certain things, they decide to put things in their personal emails or not. Lots of things going on at the executive level that you want to be informed about this. So, my belief, you're never going to get to any sort of overall performance unless you have some sort of analytic framework to make sense of what you're measuring. So, there's the NIST cybersecurity framework. I've come up with this 10 dimensions of cybersecurity performance. The difference is NIST CSF collects practices. This does not collect practices. The 10 dimensions is focused on performance. The biggest challenge I've had is, how do you measure all of these things that we can't immediately tie to activities? So, I needed to have a performance measurement system. So the approach we use, if anybody's familiar with the balanced scorecard method in corporate performance management, it's the idea that you don't roll everything up to shareholder value, you keep things somewhat separate and related, and you look at them as an interrelated portfolio. And instead of 4 dimensions or 5, I picked 10 because I think that's the nature of the situation we're dealing with. So each dimension has its own performance hypothesis or sets, and they need to be thought through based on the nature of your business and how you sit in the information ecosystem. So one of those dimensions, I was talking with a colleague earlier, a much esteemed colleague I might add, how do you evaluate the quality of your protections and controls? Independently, are they the best ones, the right ones, somewhat independently of the threat environment? Can you look at the quality of those on their own? So I advocate sort of a TQM approach to this, where you're thinking about defects and root cause analysis associated with them. So there's an amazing literature and 25 years of international experience on how you do systematic quality improvement. And I think we can import about, I'd say, 2/3 of that thinking, maybe half of the methods, and apply it to the quality of protections and controls that you have in place. Now, with the other dimensions, and I won't go through the whole model, you can find that on the blog, you look at the other aspects. Do we even have the right controls in the first place? Do we have the right intelligence from them? Are we managing our interfaces external to the organization in an effective way, and so on? So, I'm going to wrap up here, then we'll have a good 10 minutes for Q&A and debate. So, here's where this thing is. I think it works both in theory and practice. From a small base, the usage is really, it's up and to the right. There's really strong global momentum toward adoption and a vibrant user community. And I want to close on this cautionary note. So we're all metrics people. A significant number of us have significant relationships. Before you implement this method or any other, think through, do I really want to collapse this complex system into a performance index? And what consequences might flow from it? So here's my contact information. Feel free to email me, Mr. Meritology on Twitter. There's the blog link. So we've got about, how many more minutes, sir? 13? Yeah, great. So if we can close the door, feel free to step up to the mic, or if you want to shout out, whatever you want to do. Questions, comments? I like it, I hate it. Okay. There you go.
It's turned on, and
Now
it is on. Okay. This is for, I assume Adrian actually piped this mic in there so that, you know, the people that are watching this afterward can actually hear what we say. Okay, so my biggest question would be around your potential outcomes, your states. And so I think you defined a couple, like this is good, we're not really sure this is bad, things like that. How would that apply to a risk program? If I'm rating risks, would I be rating them low, medium, high? And if I was doing that, would I be taking into account, how would I take into account things like taking into account the actor who was acting against the risk?
Excellent question. I'm very happy that you asked that. Part of the reason that's significant is I spend a lot of my time over the last 7 or 8 years on specifically quantitative risk analysis. The short answer is that this sort of approach is not analytically adequate to deal with probabilistic risk analysis. You can subdivide, using FAIR or any other taxonomy, subsets. So let's say you wanted to measure resistance, which is one subset. You might create a performance index on a certain set of controls that fits into your model of resistance as FAIR defines it. But you can take the FAIR approach as one. You can take other approaches to probabilistic risk analysis. You can extend it further to include adversarial behavior. This approach is not intended, and explicitly not intended, to try and envelop that sort of complexity, because you need conditional probabilities and a bunch of things that are not factored into it. Other questions, comments? Yeah, please.
Good talk. I just actually went through your spreadsheet. Very good. I have 2 questions. The first one is, can you talk a little bit more about the results after you implemented the system, I guess, where you are in terms of your...
A little louder, thank you.
Can you talk about your results after you implemented this system currently, in terms of either your interactions with the board or executives, or just overall, I guess, improvement in your program? That's the first question. The second question is, I see that you're also in the financial vertical, as I am also, and a lot of times they want to know, aside from these metrics that are really good, which is how do we compare to our neighbors, right? So this is great, but what about so-and-so? How are we compared to them? So for example, when I went through your spreadsheet, I ran everything, and I got this score, elite, average, above average. Question I can see my management asking is, okay, well, who's elite? Like, how do we compare to them?
Very good questions. For reasons you might imagine, I can't go very far in describing what my employer does or doesn't do and the consequences. What I can say is a couple generalities. First generality is this has been implemented and tested in some operational settings first. This is not being yet implemented, to my knowledge, at the board level. So this is aimed at sort of smaller problems. I personally believe it will work with the chief risk officer presenting to a board, but we don't have a use case of that. And my particular role, I'm focused on much more narrow data science type stuff. So your second question is, well, how do we compare? This is a vital issue for all of us analysts to understand, because this is what's going on in the minds of the people that you're trying to influence. Right? You're giving them information to support decisions, but they're also thinking about, well, I hear this from my guy, but what about this other guy? And so much of executive decision making is talking with and comparing notes with what their peer companies do. Sometimes their peer company looks like them. Sometimes their peer company is Netflix, or whoever their favorite CIO is, or you know the routine. Much of what falls under the umbrella of compliance, risk, audit in financial services and many other things is designed explicitly to make that cross-organization comparison effective. Yet in doing so, it squeezes all the juice out of it, in my opinion. Until this becomes more widespread in adoption, Sometime before I die, I would love to see some significant fraction of companies adopting this 10-dimension framework. If they adopt these performance dimensions by some definition, they should be able to compare performance indexes between them. And frankly, if intermediaries, let's say the companies that are at the center of the value chain, the Walmarts or Bank of America's or whoever that drives the behavior of all their vendors, if they start baking this into their contracts, if it starts getting baked into cyber insurance contracts, it's through those vehicles that we're going to start to see standardization, much like we see standardization in business and consumer credit reporting. Anything else? Okay, one more.
So, do you have to make any allowances, or are there any peculiarities with using this with time series data?
So, there's time series data, there's two flavors of it. There's time series data for which the metric values themselves change every month or every week or something. And the only consideration there is if some metrics are gathered quarterly and others monthly and others weekly and others on the Julian calendar and I've in the past used to work in marketing. We used to aggregate numbers. Some were over quarters and some were over fiscal years, and you have this alignment problem. So the pragmatics of alignment and how fast things change, and is a metric lagging or is it synchronous? Those can be accounted for in your performance hypothesis as you account for the relative reliability of each one. And you might even have multiple metrics to account for the fact that this one only updates quarterly. You might have a cruder metric that updates more frequently. Okay. A more subtle problem in time series is things that only unfold in patterns of time. So time to discover a new incident or breach, or time to discover a new vulnerability, or time to close a firewall request. We had a debate in Michael's session about whether mean time to close was a useful metric. Is it the 90th percentile? Is it the change between them? That is fruitful ground for further investigation. So my advice, and this is how this scoring system is different. Start with whatever simple thing seems obvious or nobody's going to argue with or you can't think of anything better. Use it, and you might find some opportunity to improve upon it. And eventually, after the second or third or fourth iteration, you might have a diagnostic. You might actually have a machine learning program operating on that time series to detect anomalies in the time series, and that's your metric. So if you heard of the phrase control charts in TQM, control charts are nothing more than a simple method for determining whether the process is governed by a normal distribution or not. Because if it's not governed by a normal distribution, you have to do other things until it is. And once it's governed by a normal distribution, then you can focus on average values and you can improve those average values systematically. So time series stuff is important. There's some trickiness. There's also plenty of room for opportunity there.
Have you run into anything where because you're measuring things, they change the rules on how they actually measure things? Because I found when a metric becomes a target, it's no longer a good metric sometimes.
I'm so glad you asked that. I actually thought about putting a slide in this. How many heard of the recent news with Toshiba Corporation? Some high percentage of Toshiba executives have been fired. They have been severely punished. Apparently, over the course of a couple years, there was systematic gaming or cheating on revenues and costs to the total sum of $1 billion. So we talk about, cyber impact. I mean, $1 billion, that's real money. Outside of the realm of cybersecurity, the folks in the Atlanta school system, multiple people have gone to jail, apparently some suicides, some serious problems with gaming systems. I really believe in the value of metrics. I really believe in the value of aggregating performance. I really believe in the value of perverse management of that to drive the worst possible behavior. So this is powerful and dangerous stuff, and anybody involved in it, if you're feeding ground truth metrics, if you've come up with a scoring system, just like you go through your penetration tests on your technical systems, you need to do a pen test on this. How can people game it? I'm shocked that there's gambling going on in this casino. I need some more chips, please. So it's intrinsic to the nature of measuring things. It's intrinsic to the way Western society works and the way incentive systems work. And the only way to deal with it is integrity in the scoring system, using it for useful purposes like continuous learning, and not for unproductive purposes like tell me who I should fire. Okay, thank you all, ladies and gentlemen.